In this presentation, you will learn about classical theorists from the conflict theory. The first theories of conflict were macro-historical in nature, focusing on the greater structural changes that could occur as a result of conflict between society's primary social groups, which are also interest groups, with often opposing aims. The historical circumstances for evolution or transformation were recognized as sustained features of the system that were naturally antagonistic. Karl Marx, a 19th century macro sociologist, was the first to offer a thorough theory of social revolution through the operation of conflict between different parts of society. His historical materialism thesis set the stage for the development of a conflict theory of social transformation based on the fundamental contradiction that exists between classes in society due to unequal economic distribution. According to him, the bourgeois is created by property or capital ownership, and the proletariats are the workers whose labor is exploited to keep the bourgeois in power. In political terms, this was interpreted as a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, as the Communist Manifesto phrased it. Marx, on the other hand, identified a considerably more complicated and nuanced reality as a thinker and historiographer, as he chronicled the many historical epochs. His theory of social evolution was also prescient as he predicted that feudalism would give way to capitalism, a process that was already underway, which would be followed by socialism or the abolition of the concept of private property, which would bring society stability by eliminating all class contradictions. His thesis was politically incorrect, but the method, conflict perspective of dialectics, of opposing forces colliding to form a third stage of stability or new oppositions as the driving force of history, was accepted and is the core premises of conflict theory in sociology. The sociological theory of conflict, on the other hand, is largely non-political. It does not support communism, capitalism, or any other political philosophy. The goal is to identify the main social groups and processes that cause change, as well as to develop a general theory of social structures and their organization from a dynamic standpoint. Max Weber is the next significant classical theorist to be identified. His significant contribution to Marxian theory was to establish that, in addition to economic classes, there were also non-economic status groups and power groups that were responsible for social stratification. Weber was especially interested in the many types of social organizations, since it is through them that important weapons of conflict and revolt are produced, and it is through them that society asserts its weapons of dominance and control. As a result, Weber established three ideal forms of organizational structures: ideal typical, bureaucratic, and patrimonial, which can be found in any form of dominance, such as the state, the church, or the economy. Weber was able to demonstrate how certain types of dominance become acceptable and may endure even if they are exploitative and discriminatory by introducing the concept of legitimacy into power. There are societal mechanisms in place, such as socialization, to ensure that the general public accepts institutions like the state and the church, at least to a point, and alternative organizations that oppose them must build their own legitimacy and structure in order to be effective. In order to be effective, opposition forces must also organize and establish internal bureaucracy. Organizations that begin with charismatic leadership, such as new political parties, eventually settle down to rational, legal, and even traditional types of leadership. As a result, they may elect the next generation of leaders or follow dynastic rule. A particular religious reform, such as the Protestant reform, arose from the charismatic leadership of an individual called Martin Luther, but it later became an organization with its own internal bureaucracy and status hierarchy. The current Protestant church leaders are generally not charismatic, but rather rational, legal, and very rarely combine charisma with the more formal requirements. Despite the fact that this protest movement underwent huge alterations and that there was and still is violent struggle, as in Ireland, over the partition of the Christian church, the new forms have become routinized and establish a status based hierarchy. Weber had a lasting impact on the development of sociology, even though subsequent scholars did not expand on his contributions and instead pursued their own paths. Louis Corsair was a key figure in the development of classical conflict theory. He was born in Berlin in 1913 and studied at Sorbonne in Paris before being imprisoned by the French authorities for being German during World War II. He was granted asylum in the United States and received his PhD from Columbia University in New York, where he studied under Robert K. Merton. Instead of following Weber, Corsair chose to follow Simmel. He believed that conflict is inherent not only in society but also in the human being. It is a component of our natural human behavior. He proposed the terms absolute and relative deprivation. When a human group is deprived of all resources to the point where members are barely able to exist, this is known as absolute deprivation. They lack fundamental necessities such as food, drinking water, healthcare, and housing. The term relative deprivation refers to people who are better off but still have enough survival resources to think about and compare themselves to those who are far better off. When society as a whole is well equipped, yet there are significant differences between the rich and the poor, relative deprivation is more likely to arise. People living in absolute poverty, as has been observed, rarely engage in violence because they lack the resources to do so. For example, we frequently hear about people in isolated rural places who are starving, but we seldom hear about them fighting. However, as Corsair points out, the odds of conflict grow when people go from absolute to relative impoverishment. The Dalit movement, for example, arose not from the rural areas where the untouchables lived a life of bare survival and absolute misery, but from the urban districts where the untouchables lived a life of bare survival and total agony. It began in urban industrial areas where the rural poor had migrated as wage labor. Despite being poor and exploited, they had some cash income, and because they worked in larger groups as industrial labor, they were able to band together and organize under the charismatic leadership of B.R. Ambedkar. Only after they moved to cities and were exposed to urban life were they able to realize their exploitation and compare and contrast their living conditions. Corsair also classified conflict levels as emerging from various social settings and conflict development conditions. Escalation and persistence of violence are less likely when people have clearly defined goals that are both pragmatic and rational. Because the objectives are well defined and attainable, such as a higher wage for workers or better living circumstances for the poor in cities, tension will dissipate once the demands are realized. Workers on strike, for example, may call off the strike. When the goals are emotionally charged and transcendental, the fight becomes more violent and persistent. Take, for example, the long running battles over religion, ethnicity, and subnationalisms. Such emotionally charged and esoteric goals are unresolvable, much like the unresolvable hostility between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, which frequently bursts into greater violence. Corsair, following the functional school of his time, classified conflict into two forms, external and internal to the group, to identify the functional characteristics of conflict. Internal group conflict is often of low intensity but occurs frequently. When two or more potentially antagonistic groups, such as whites and blacks in the United States, Hindus and Muslims in India, Protestants and Catholics in the United Kingdom, dwell in close proximity to one another, small scale and regular skirmishes are likely. However, most of the time, such low intensity violence can be contained by internal law and order processes and tensions tend to dissipate, resulting in comparatively extended periods of peace. The good side of such small scale disputes is that it leads to better administrative machinery organization and more developed conduct norms. Improved labor rules, for example, restrict frequent flare ups between workers and management, which might be harmful to the economy. External conflict also serves to strengthen the group's internal cohesion and create more clearly defined boundaries. Thank you for watching the presentation. Do like, subscribe, share, and leave your comments about this presentation or any other topics you would like to learn more about.